it's my pleasure to introduce Sandra Rozo and Dany Bahar, who are with us today for the first seminar after the summer break. Both Sandra and Dany are well-known scholars in the field of the economics of migration, focusing on different aspects of this topic: the determinants and consequences of refugee flows, influence on migrants and in countries, influence of international migration and structural transformation on migrant sending countries. So it's really a pleasure to have the two of you online today. You will be working in tandem, I hope. So Sandra presenting the paper and Dany helping her answering clarifying questions that are submitted by attendees via the Q&A function. So Sandra, the floor is yours. You have 45 minutes approximately.
Super. So thank you, Simone. First of all, before I begin, I wanted to thank you and the other organizers of this very exciting seminar. I have tuned in many of your seminars, and it has been a pleasure. So I'm very excited to be part of the excellent group of researchers you have invited. So the paper that I will present today is joint work with Dany, who's very kindly joining us, and he will be answering the questions, and María Ibáñez, and she's at the Inter-American Development Bank. And just to kind of give you a very rough overview of what I will be talking about, this paper is going to evaluate the labor market impacts of a very large-scale amnesty that was given in Colombia to Venezuelan refugees. So before I begin, I want to kind of motivate this talk with two main trends that we have seen on this topic. So one of them is that refugees are mostly hosted in developing countries. So despite the fact that we see a lot of media and a lot of complaints coming from the northern developed countries about how many refugees they are hosting, it is actually the developing countries who are hosting the lion's share of these migrations. So for example, in this graph that I am illustrating in the presentation, we ranked the top 20 countries that are hosting refugees between 2000 and 2018. And you can see that of the 20 countries, 18 are developing countries. And of course, this is not surprising because these are the countries that are most likely the neighbors of countries that are facing conflict. But it's something that actually kind of changes the whole understanding that we have on the impacts of refugees. And another thing that is very interesting about this topic is that there is a very, very large spectrum heterogeneity of policies that hosting countries, developing countries, offer to refugees when they arrive. So you have everything from very restrictive countries like Bangladesh, who requires refugees to stay in a refugee camp, so they are not allowed to be fully mobile, they are not allowed to work, and until very recently, say a few weeks ago, they actually were allowed to use the internet. And then you have other countries who are in the middle, like Peru, Turkey, Jordan, who offer employer-sponsor permits or quotas for the number of foreigners in each firm. And other countries like Jordan that actually allow refugees to work, or migrants even in general, to work in certain sectors like agriculture, construction, manufacturing, but they restrict all of the other sectors. And then we have Colombia, which actually makes me very proud. And I always say this because it's something that I feel very passionate about. So Colombia is a very, very generous country. It's one of the most generous countries in the world right now with refugees. So refugees, when they arrive, they are allowed to move freely in the country. And they are actually, a very, very large amount of them were offered this very large amnesty that is the topic of this paper. So this is like in an attempt to place this paper in the literature that is surrounding this topic, I wanted to say two things. So most of the literature that we have so far has been focusing on seeing the impacts of amnesties that are partial. And when I say partial, what I mean is that it is kind of localized to or targeting certain types of migrants or refugees, for example, those that are more educated or that have more capital, but it's very rarely offered to the whole vast amount of people that arrive without any eligibility criteria. And another thing that is like common in the literature is that most of it is focused on the developed countries, right? So what is our contribution here? So we're gonna offer the evaluation of this large and sudden regularization. It was, I will kind of describe the details in a second, but it was kind of a consequences of a decision made by the president. He didn't even let their public officials on his team know what he was considering. So that it was really, really surprising for everyone, the decision that he made. And what is also very interesting about this regularization is that it had no provisions or eligibility criteria. well, let me kind of actually say that there was one small thing, which is that they were required to show that they were born in Venezuela. So that's the one thing that was required. This, however, is something that is easier for them to have that document because everyone widely in Venezuela has the Cédula de Ciudadanía, which is what they can use to actually register for this program. Other thing that is very interesting about this program is that it's taking place in a developing country. And of course, developing countries are different. This is something that all of us understand very clearly. They have large informal sector, and that could map into very different consequences. Like, for example, maybe refugees don't want to be formalized. They already have a job in the informal sector, and they don't want to be part of the formal sector because they will have to pay taxes, right? It is a possibility that they don't really want to enter the formal sector. So we actually were very interested in seeing what was going to happen with this program. So the question that we're going to ask is how this very large regularization, or 500,000 Venezuelan refugees in Colombia, impact labor markets. And so here's the outline of my presentation. So I will briefly describe the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Then I will describe the program, our empirical strategy and data, the results. If I have time, I would enter in detail to talk about the robustness test. If we don't have time, that's the part that I would encourage you to go and check for details in the paper. It's available for everyone. And then we will discuss the conclusions. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Venezuelan crisis, I will kind of briefly tell you about it. So I was born in Colombia and I lived there for 26 years. And I remember when I was growing up, around the 80s, 90s, everyone in Latin America saw Venezuela as a very prosperous country. And I remember everyone saying all the technology was coming from Venezuela, we will go on vacations to Venezuela. So it was a very, very prospering country in Latin America. And this changed dramatically with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998. So he was a populist leader. I have to say that he was a charismatic leader. He was liked by the people when he was initially elected. But as soon as he arrived, he started to do constitutional amendments to kind of expropriate the private sector, started introducing nationalizations of public goods. And his successor, who was appointed in 2013, Nicolás Maduro, actually strengthened all of these policies, and corruption became rampant. And he had an additional constraint, which was that he could not use the oil revenues as Chavez was able to do before him, because the prices actually dropped when he was elected. And he also faced very large US sanctions. And so the consequences of this crisis have been devastating for this country. So this is all data by 2018. And I have to recognize that this is not coming from official sources. So most of the data in Venezuela is actually not produced by the government. This is all independent sources. But if you compare 1998 versus 2018, you would see that Venezuela has experienced a 50% contraction of GDP. Unemployment is approximately 40%, poverty rates are nearly 90%. There are shortages of food and basic services, specifically targeting medications. There is a health crisis that is very, very strong in the country. Insecurity is rampant, and there is a very, very clear repression for the opposition in Venezuela. So not surprisingly, a lot of refugees, a lot of people have been kind of moving away from the country and arriving to all the other countries that are close to Venezuela. So in the map that you can see on your right, you would see shade for the hosting countries, and the darker the color, the more refugees the country has received. So Colombia is the main recipient of Venezuelan refugees. By December of 2019, Colombia had received approximately 4.5 Venezuelan refugees had left, and approximately 1.8 had arrived to Colombia. And it is very important when we talk about refugee migration that we have in mind that these are always underreported numbers, because the refugees, many of them are afraid to actually register because they don't know what's going to happen with their situation, if they're going to be deported. And there is not really that much of a strong control in the borders. So Colombia can control the main, let's say, highways to kind of see who's moving, but there is a lot of informal crossing points that Colombia really doesn't control. And so there is a lot of informal migration. And so this is, of course, an let's say, report of the true number of Venezuelan refugees. So what happened, or what is the context of this program? So in 2018, the government of Juan Manuel Santos, the president in office then, decided to do a census. And this was widely advertised between word of mouth, grocery stores, radio. And what they tried to advertise was that they were collecting a census to count the number of undocumented refugees in Colombia. So what is very important about this is that this was never advertised as a program that would later offer them an amnesty. The original idea of this census was just to know how many people were in Colombia. Of course, there is a selection issues that you might be thinking on. For example, there might be people that didn't hear about the census because they didn't have enough networks, or they might be afraid to register because they didn't know what this was going to be used for. So all of those selection issues are there. But considering all of those restrictions, between April 6 and June 8, the government was able to register approximately 500,000 people. So it's exactly 442,000 individuals, which were grouped in 253K households. And so what happened was that at the end of, let's say, the presidential term, which was to be over at the beginning of August of that year, before leaving office, the president decided that he was going to offer a large amnesty to anyone who was registered in that census. As I said, this was surprising even for the people who worked with him. Nobody was expecting this to happen. And he announced it, and the next day, a decree was actually issued. It was at the end of July. And it offered something called the Permiso Temporal de Permanencia, which was a temporary job permit for 2 years. And it would allow everyone who was registered in that census to actually get a formal job if they wanted to. That paper would allow them to do that. And they could register between August 2nd and the end of December. And so of all of these people who are registered in the census, approximately 281,000 individuals actually registered to get this permit. So here we're illustrating the registration points of the ramp. Remember, the ramp is this census, no? The census that originally was used to offer everyone who was registered there can get the job permit, the PEP. And so there were 1,100 approximately registration or station points. And how it worked was that wherever there was very large Venezuelan population, or that there were bordering municipalities, or that the municipality actually asked for a station, they would get a station to register migrants. But you can see in the south of the country that there were not many stations in the south of the country. Overall, of the 32 departments in Colombia, 23 had registration points. So how do you apply for the job permit? So the first thing, as I have said, is that you needed to be registered in this census. And so this is this requirement here, no? Be registered in the ramp. The second thing is that you needed to be inside Colombia when the decree was issued. And the third thing is that there should not be any criminal orders or deportation orders against you, so that you were able to actually acquire that permit. So one thing that I want you to keep in mind is that for you to be able, or for the migrant to be able to register for the census, they actually need to be able to show that they were born in Venezuela. So as I said, this is a very, I would say, minor restriction, because as long as they have their cédula de ciudadanía, which is a widely available documentation in Venezuela for individuals, they would be able to show that. And one thing that I want you to keep in mind moving forward, because we're going to use that for identification, is that once an individual registered for the census, they were actually given a random registration number when they entered the census. And we're going to use this number later on, so this is important for you to keep in mind. So once you registered in the census, this is the first thing that you needed to actually satisfy, and you satisfy all of the other requirements. How do you get the PEP? So you will go online, and you will fill a very basic form, and you would print it. It was free, and with that document that you print anywhere, that's going to be your temporary job permit. So again, I want to acknowledge that there might be selection issues here. So it is possible that many migrants who did not register to get the job permit didn't do it because they didn't have access to a computer, or they don't know how to actually do this process online. And so all of these restrictions are going to be there, but there is also the positive side. This was free. This was done online to kind of make it available anywhere where there was internet, of course. And so in that sense, this was a very generous and program that tried to reach as many people as was possible. So the reason why I say that this is one of the most generous programs that has ever been offered in recent history is because the program not only offer migrants the opportunity to get a job, formal job, or to ask for a formal job, but it also allowed them to be scored by SISBEN. And SISBEN is the main proxy score in Colombia, which will enable anyone to access any of the social programs. So if you had that PEP, theoretically, you could go and get this score, SISBEN, and then you will have access to any of the social programs offered in Colombia. So one of the most important programs that you would entitle to access once you get this score is the subsidized health regime. And basically, this would give you complete access to all of the health services. So before, or someone that doesn't have the job permit would only have access to emergency services. So the health right is universal in Colombia. So anyone who has any health issues can go to the emergency services. But for you to get complete health services, you would need to be part of this program. Again, theoretically, this program would enable the migrants to get a bank account. And of course, the main objective of this program was to offer them a work permit so that they could enter the formal sector. Again, keep in mind, these migrants might be already working in the informal sector, but they now can actually apply for a job in the formal sector. So when I say theoretically, the reason why I use this word is because when we started seeing the results of our paper, and because we're doing some other research moving forward, we started to do some qualitative surveys with Ana María Ibáñez, Andrés Moya, and Marisol Rodriguez. And the idea of these qualitative surveys was to try to understand why we were seeing the results we were observing and what may be the most important impacts of this program for migrants. And when we started doing those surveys, we found this qualitative focus group, what we started seeing was that many of the migrants reported that theoretically they were supposed to get all of these things, but when they in practice went to apply for them, there were a lot of bottlenecks. Bottlenecks like they would go to a bank and the bank would refuse to give them a bank account. Why? Because they were Venezuelans and they were part of the private sector. So there were stories like a migrant saying that he had to actually say, hey, this is my right. I have that this is the law, you are supposed to be able to give me a bank account. And in some cases that worked, and in other cases it didn't, and the banks refused to give them access. So there's all of these mixed stories. So despite the fact that the government is trying to make the path easier, there's also these sad stories for some migrants in which the community is actually creating bottlenecks for them. So what we're going to use, I wanted to kind of show you very briefly, was a little bit of a characterization of who was registered in the census. Okay, so we have very rich and vast information. And so I wouldn't have time to show you everything we've learned about the migrants, but I just wanted to kind of give you a very rough overview of the data that we have. And so here in this column, we have descriptive statistics for the census. So you can see that 63% of the people who actually register in the census applied for the job permit. And in these two columns, we're actually describing those individuals that had the PEP, who applied for the PEP, and those who did not. And of that information, I wanted to highlight 4 main trends that I thought were very interesting. So one of them is that we observed that those individuals who actually applied for the job permit had more education years. And they also were part of the informal sector disproportionately. So they already had a job in the informal sector. So we read this as evidence of saying maybe they had better returns of applying to this permit because they would probably be able to improve their situation more relative to the other migrants. And the other thing that we observed for those migrants who applied is that they had fewer networks, and we measure networks as the number of migrants who live in the same municipality where they are located, and that also, of course, came from Venezuela, and they know less people, let's say, and they also had lower access to health services in general. So again, all of this probably pointing to the idea that they might have more returns of actually registering for this job permit. Okay, so let me now get into details and tell you a little bit of how we identify the impacts of this program. So ideally, if we didn't have any endogeneity concerns, what we would end up doing would be just a difference in difference estimation, in which we will compare those areas that had a higher proportion of people registered to get the job permit before and after the program, right? So before I kind of talk about endogeneity concerns, let me walk you through this equation here, because that's going to be the base where we're going to start. So basically what we're going to have is here in Y of all of our labor outcomes at the individual level. The department level, Colombia is divided in 32 departments, and we're going to observe them monthly, so monthly year time variation. And so this variable here is going to be the treatment variable. It's going to represent the number of people who actually applied for the PEP. So we describe it here below. It's going to be the share of people who are 10 and 64 years old, who applied for the PEP divided by the population of that department. And we actually created a rate by 100,000 individuals. The reason is that we wanted to prevent that this logarithm was going to become negative, so that we didn't have interpretation issues. And so this is going to be the treatment variable, and this is going to be an indicator dummy for post-treatment implementation. And here we're going to have the typical individual covariates, including age, dummy for head of household, education level, gender. And here in this interaction, we're going to have a number of variables that are observed at baseline before the program was implemented, interacted by year trends. And so here we're going to have everything from economic growth, conflict, labor market outcomes observed at baseline, geographic variables, and public expenditures. And we were going to have also fixed effects by department and by month.
Sandra?
Yeah.
To interrupt you for the first time. Sorry.
Of course, yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm just curious. I don't know if I just missed it quickly. I mean, your outcome variables, you're looking at outcomes for Colombians or for Venezuelans or for both?
Thank you. Great. So I am kind of experimenting with first showing the equation and then talking about the sample. We'll see how that works. So you haven't missed it. I am going to talk about that in a second. Yes, we're going to actually evaluate the program for 3 samples of workers: Colombian workers, Venezuelan migrants, and also individuals who were Colombian but were living in Venezuela and returned in the last 5 years.
But you don't have information on whether people themselves actually have a PEP. So you can't look at the impact of regularization.
Yeah, by the individual, no, unfortunately not. But I can tell you that we're working in doing that right now. So we are collecting a phone survey in which with the census data, we're able to track these migrants, and we're actually trying to measure the impacts that the program has had on the migrants themselves. But this is on the process side. This is not something I will talk about today. All right. And the very last thing I want to say before I move on is that because there are only 23 departments for which the data is going to be representative, we're going to have to correct our standard errors for wild bootstrap because there is bias in our inference if we don't correct them. Okay, so this is what we would do ideally, in the ideal world where refugees are dropped in a municipality randomly, which of course is not the case. So the migration choice is endogenous. They are moving to areas where they are offered more economic opportunities, where they have more networks, where they feel safer. And that in itself makes also the PEP application endogenous, right? Because where there is more migrants, probably there's also going to be more applications. And so because of that, we need to instrument our treatment variation. So what I want to say is that the temporal part of our difference in difference, which is the indicator variable for post-dummy implementation, is actually, we argue, plausibly exogenous because it was just the president who decided to say one day to the other, okay, beginning tomorrow, everyone can register to get an amnesty. There was not really any endogenous reason for this to happen or any plans that were announced. So the part that is truly endogenous is the geographic location of migrants. And this is this PEP share. And so this is what we're gonna instrument. So how are we gonna instrument this part? We're gonna instrument it with this number that I mentioned earlier that was offered to refugees when they register in the census. So remember, when someone registered in the census, they were giving this random number. And the idea of that number was to kind of smooth the load in which the public officials will process the census. And that was the main idea of that number. So basically what we're gonna do is we're gonna create like a weighted average because based on that number that you were given, you were offered registration window. So for everyone, the registration window is going to close in December of 2018. But depending on your number, your window will begin earlier or later, and you will have more or less days to register. So what we did is, because we observed the time window that was allotted to each individual, we calculated a weighted average in which we say, okay, according to this, what is the average registration days that was offered to the migrants who applied there for the job permit? And so here, you can see the distribution of the registration days. for the PEP. And so there is a decent amount of mass in across the distribution. So it actually has a range between 76 and 141 days. And you can see that there are individuals distributed all across the registration window. So one thing that we wanted to illustrate with this figure is that there was actually action all across the period. So remember that the period to actually begin registering for this job permit was open in August and it closed in December 21. So what we wanted to check was, is it true that maybe they all register at the beginning or they all register at the end? So it is very important for us to be able to show that there is actually variation all across. So in this graph, what we're showing you is the daily flow and the total stock of PEP registrations. So the bars are going to be the flow. So how many individuals register each day, and the red line is going to be the stock. So what I want you to kind of focus on is that this red line has a positive slope. So there has been always a positive registration across the period. Of course, it's a little bit flatter at the end, but it's still positive, strictly positive, all across the period. So there has been registration going on all across our time of analysis. And here, so this map is a map of Colombia, and what we're illustrating here is two things. So one of them is the PEP share, let's say the number of individuals who register for the job permit over the population between 10 and 64 years. And the registration days, the average registration days, this instrument that we created. So there is a strong correlation between both variables, and you can see that the circles tend to overlap with the darker areas in the map. So another thing that we thought was very important to show is that we wanted to illustrate that indeed there is variation in the instrument. In other words, if we were to do just a scatter plot, a very simple scatter plot of the average registration days, our instrument, which is here in the horizontal axis, versus the number of individuals who register for the job permit, will we see that there's variation across the different departments. So each of these points is a department in Colombia. And you can see that there is a positive correlation between both variables. So yes, it is true that those areas that had more average registration days also observed more registrations. We just included here a linear fit and a quadratic fit just to kind of show you for illustrative purposes. And the very last thing that I wanted to show you before we move on to kind of talking about the data and the results is that we were, of course, very worried about the plausibility of the exogeneity assumption, right? So is it true that this number was truly exogenous, that the average registration days that we have constructed is truly exogenous variable? So what we did to test this is we just take that variation, which is a cross-section variation, and we regress it in different variables that we observed at the department level. We also did it at the municipal level, but I'm here just showing you the department level. And we regress it in population variables, in labor market variables observed at baseline before the program was implemented, share of informality, support for the government, growth, conflict, illegality measured through hectares of coca, government activity, geographic variables, early settlements of migrants, and none of these are significant. So we say, okay, then maybe it is true, or there is some suggestive evidence that is going to be supporting the validity of our instrument.
Sandra, can I ask you another question?
Of course.
I'm just kind of curious. I mean, do you, to Dany also, but I mean, I guess it's directly to you. I mean, do you not, I mean, typically we think of a difference in difference model. I mean, if you believe the underlying assumptions of the difference in difference model, the parallel trends assumption, it should deal with endogeneity concerns. So it's a little bit weird. I find it a bit strange to try to embed, I mean, I guess it comes back to my original question of who you were looking at, because I could see that maybe, I could see one model being, like for example, the difference in difference model to me, if you were looking at the outcomes for Colombians, could work very well because you could go back for a long period and estimate parallel trends for different areas. And Venezuelans probably moved to areas based on long run labor market stuff, which has already affected Colombians for a long time. When you're looking at outcomes for Venezuelans, you don't have a long time. They haven't been in Colombia for a long time. So it's much more cross-sectional variation. And then your IV makes more sense. I mean, I kind of would think, I mean, this maybe it's more of a comment than a question, that you might benefit from splitting the two sections apart and thinking about using a simple difference in difference for Colombians and a simple IV for the Venezuelans, because having it together is a bit, I mean, I'm trying to think about what the assumptions are. It's a bit complicated actually, because it's a little unusual to try to embed an IV into a difference in difference model. But I don't know if you've thought I don't know if you don't have to answer that now if you don't want
this
me.
Is a great question. No. We have thought about this. So the let's say the main motivation. So two things. So first, we'll show you the results of both because we we have thought about this, and actually, you will see that it's not dramatically different. But why we were motivated to actually introduce the instrument was because we thought of this endogeneity as being dynamic. So what we thought is migrants don't kind of move to one place and stay there. But if economic conditions vary or the job permits affect different in the market, they will move to other place. And that movement is also endogenous. And so because of that, that assumption of parallel trend might be actually trending differently, right? Because of migrants themselves. And so this was the main motivation, that the endogeneity is dynamic. And because of that, we need something that is actually varying not only at the geographical level, but at the time, and that's why we have the interaction of the post-dummy treatment and the geographic variation.
Okay.
But I'll show you both so that.
But it might be cleaner then to do like a repeated IV on different, IV for 2000 and I forgot what years you have.
That's a great suggestion.
2017, 2018.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Well taken, and we definitely can try and see if that changes our results. I think that's a fair comment. Thank you. Okay, so the data. The data is pretty straightforward, basically labor force surveys, so nothing very sophisticated, which was what was available in Colombia at the time. So these are repeated cross-sections that we observed between January of 2017 monthly up until February of 2020. And these are representative in 23 departments that are the ones that have the main cities of the country, of the 32 that Colombia has. That include the typical information, individual socio-demographics, labor outcomes, and interestingly, we also observe the nationality of the individuals who are interviewed and the date of arrival. So when we were kind of building this paper, we were exploring, is it true that the Colombian government is actually interviewing Venezuelans? And we started to see that they are actually interviewing Venezuelans more and more and more in every survey. So one caveat, however, is that that survey is not representative of the Venezuelan workers. It's only representative of the Colombian workers, but they're trying to build information to characterize those workers for the future. However, what we did was, just as a suggestive evidence, try to see, like, okay, what happens if we estimate the impacts of the program for that group of migrants that we observe? I'll talk about that in a second with more detail. And we also use this census, the census that I have been talking about, no? the undocumented migrant census. And with this, we're going to be able to know how many people registered and create our instrument. Okay, so the samples, which was Stephen's question. So we're going to actually evaluate the labor market of the program, the PEP program, in for Colombian nationals, and for Venezuelan migrants, and for Colombian returnees. So Colombian returnees are those individuals who lived in Colombia and returned to Colombia in the last 5 years. So as I said earlier in my presentation, Venezuela was a very prosperous country, and there was a lot of migration taking place before the Chavez election from Colombia to Venezuela. So I have even family myself that lived there and actually returned when this crisis began. So we have a lot of Colombian movement going back as well. Why we want to study 2 and 3? Apart? Well, because these people are very likely different from Colombian nationals. Why? Because they have probably less time in the country, they have less networks, they are more vulnerable, and of course, the program should be affecting probably more disproportional Venezuelan migrants who are direct substitutes of the individuals who are actually legalized by this amnesty. And we're going to study 4 outcomes. So these are very common, straightforward in labor economics. So we're going to use the logarithm of the weekly hours worked, the logarithm of monthly wages, employment rate, an indicator variable for employment, and an indicator variable for labor force participation. So those are the 4 outcomes that we're going to study. Okay, so what do we see? What are the impacts of the program? So long story short, we don't really see any impacts of the program, which was very surprising to us because you're legalizing 500,000 people. But I want you to kind of focus here on the second stage, panel C, and you will see that we don't really see any significant impacts. It's a very precise 0. And in employment, we actually observe a negative effect, but it's negligible because remember that this variable here, PEP holders, has a logarithm transformation. So we actually have to divide this coefficient by 100. So if PEP holders increase in 1, the employment will actually increase in 0.1 percentage points. So it's going to be a very, very small effect, so negligible effect almost. And we also see that our instrument is strong and consistent, zero effects across outcomes. And this is for the formal sector. For the informal sector, we see the same thing, no effects of the program. And this is for the sample of Colombian workers. And for Venezuelan migrants, very interestingly, remember that, however, this sample is not significant of these migrants, but we wanted to kind of show it as suggestive evidence. We actually see that there is a positive effect on employment, which was something that we would expect. So that might be drive the substitution of Colombian workers. However, I want to say that what you see in parentheses are the standard errors, and what you see in brackets are the p-values that correct for the small numbers of clusters, the wild bootstrap correction. And what you see is that as soon as we correct the standard errors, this is no longer significant. So there is something there. It's kind of positive, but it's not really strong. It's not really strong to any of the robustness tests that we're going to introduce. And then for all of the other things, we don't find any effects. So we also run an event study to kind of also see this parallel trend assumption between those regions that had a larger average registration days and those who didn't. And what you see here, just to illustrate the results, is that before the PEP implementation, the parallel trend assumption between them was satisfied, and we don't really see any impacts of the program after the PEP was implemented. And this is true across the outcomes that we study and the samples that we study. So I'm just illustrating one here just to do through time restrictions. We also did a heterogeneous and effect analysis. And so we try to estimate the impacts of the program by gender, by education, by skill level, by age, by firm size. And there we see that the program has had a disproportionate impact on females and on individuals that have high education. For age, there's not really a significant difference between groups. The confidence intervals in overlap. And for those individuals who are working in small firms, very small firms, but this effect is really, really small. So it's 0.0001. And so the first thing we thought was why disproportionate effect on females and individuals that have more education. So females is not surprising, they are more vulnerable workers, but the highest skill effect initially was surprising to us. But as we started digging on the data, we observed that Venezuelans tend to have a higher level of education than Colombian workers. So that might be also part of the explanation. So we run a battery of robustness tests. They are on the paper for your perusal, but basically just to kind of walk you through them, we kind of check what happens if we control for early settlements of migrants, what happens if we control for distance to the border with Venezuela, if we exclude the municipalities in the border, because there could be trade concerns, right? Those municipalities have other shocks taking place with a crisis. We control for those individuals who actually got a job permit that were not part of this large amnesty, but for example, were better educated and because of that could access a job permit earlier. And we control for that, and that doesn't change the results. And we also kind of play with our time window to see what happens if we shrink it, we begin earlier, later, and nothing changes. The results are robust across all of these exercises. And so the next step for us was, okay, so why could be explaining this? So you are legalizing 500,000 people and nothing really is happening in the market. So why is this happening? So it could be, we thought, our first explanation is that they don't want to legalize. Maybe they just are happy in the informal sector, they're not paying taxes, and they don't see any benefits of joining the formal sector. So what we did was we just run a Mincer equation in which we estimate the logarithm of wages in the typical variables and a dummy for informality to kind of see if there was a premium for joining the formal sector. Yes, there is a premium. What we observe is that formal workers actually earn almost twice what informal workers earn in Colombia. So it is unlikely that there is not really a premium and that they don't really want to join the formal sector. However, what is still possible is that they don't have information about that benefits. That's something that could happen and we don't really have any evidence on right now. But what we can say is that there is a true benefit for joining the formal sector in Colombia. So the second explanation could be that maybe firms don't want to hire them. So despite the fact that they have a permit, the firms don't want to hire migrants. Why? Maybe there are large transaction costs, maybe they don't know what the PEP is, or maybe they just dislike migrants. And I have to say that based on the current paper that we're doing, in which we're begin doing a very large qualitative work, there is a lot of evidence for this. Of course, this is qualitative evidence, but there is a lot of evidence on firms' resistance to hire Venezuelan workers. And the reason being mostly that they don't really have information what this permit is, and how do you use it, and if the government is backing it, because it's just a page, a printed page. So a lot of them don't really kind of trust it, and they are afraid that if they hire them, they train them, because it's only a temporary job permit for 2 years, what would happen after 2 years, no? And another thing that is we have seen in the qualitative groups is, yes, there is also this, you know, people who just dislike migrants and they just don't want to hire them because of that. And that's all qualitative evidence. We can't really speak quantitatively to that explanation. Another explanation could be that these are short to medium term effects, but this is, I would kind of put a little less weight on that explanation, because this is, we'll still have data 14 to 18 months after the program was implemented. So this is still a decent amount of time to kind of see something. And the final thing could be that there are other general equilibrium effects taking place, and migrants are also, of course, entering the labor force supply, but there may be also creating firms, and that together might be just creating things that don't allow us to observe or identify any impacts. So what are we doing now? And I think this is one of a very passionate project that I am very passionate about. So what we're doing now is we're trying to survey the migrants themselves, and we want to know how this PEP has affected them. And we are focusing on 4 outcomes. So labor market, well-being and income, mental health and health. So we originally went on the field, and the pandemic arrived and we had to go to phone surveys. So we're doing that. And preliminarily, when we began the qualitative work to explore potential impacts of the program, we see that the migrants say the program has been very strong to help them access health services. This is the main thing that they are using it for, at least in the qualitative groups. We have to kind of estimate with the surveys that we're collecting. But they don't really talk about formal jobs a lot. They just say, oh, this is great because we get access to health, we get access to subsidies, but nobody really says anything about formal jobs. And we're currently piloting that instrument. So this is a challenging project because these are vulnerable populations. So you have the treatment, everyone who registered for the PEP program, but the controls are undocumented migrants who don't want to be found, right? So we're working on that. So the conclusions, and I will close with that so that I can answer your questions. We don't really see any significant impacts of the program. We see small effects on informal employment, but they are negligible. And they are concentrated on females and highly educated individuals. And we see some suggestive evidence of a positive effect on the formal employment of Venezuelan refugees. So one of the main questions that we have moving forward with our surveys are they really applying to formal jobs? Why yes or why not? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. So, and thanks a lot also for keeping the time. So Dany has already handled several questions that have been raised by the attendees, but there are a few more. So there are a couple of questions regarding why the analysis has been done at the department level. So why did you decide to do the analysis at the department level? I worry departments are too large to represent cohesive labor markets, by Jeremy Lebo.
Yeah, so that's a great question. It was just mainly data restriction. So the data is only representative of the department level. And so that's why we actually are doing it that way. So it's just a data restriction. Yes, but it is true that they are large geographic units. So the country is divided in 32 departments and then in 1,100 municipalities. So it would be ideal to do a municipal analysis, but it's not, the data is not representative at that level.
Okay, there's a follow-up on this by Andres.
Yes, hi. Hi, Sandra. Thank you. Very nice presentation. Really enjoyed the paper. I was wondering why not to use, I don't know what survey are you using, if the Great Household Survey or the Quality Life Survey, but I wonder why not to use the 23 main cities. I mean, regarding, that so one is representative, I guess.
Yeah. So just to clarify, we are using the 23 departments for which the data is representative, where these cities are contained. So we have 23 units, geographic units. And the reason why we're doing it at the department level is because we have people registering in the department all across the different stations, but that are moving to work in the main city. When we did the qualitative work, we found that they were doing that. So that's why we decided to do the department level. We could also do just the city level. I don't think, however, the results would be very different, but that's a great suggestion. So it is just 23 geographic units, in this case, the departments that contain the largest 23 cities. And yes, it's the Gran Encuesta Integrada de Hogares.
I just have another follow-up question. Maybe I haven't understood properly, but do you have information about the geographical distribution of the Venezuelan refugees in the census, so who might have applied but who did not?
No, so in the census, we know where the Venezuelan migrants, so for 1993, 2005, and 2018, we know where the population of Venezuelans are.
No, sorry,
settled.
I wasn't clear. The census of the refugees that was done a few months ago.
Yeah, okay, the ramps.
So you have all the 500,000, okay,
Yes.
roughly. So you also know the geographical distribution of those who were eligible for the PEP but did not apply.
Yes, we also do that.
And there's variability across departments in the share of eligible Venezuelans that ask for the PEP or not?
So you're thinking like an intent to treat thing where we could run?
I was thinking about whether, it's flat across departments, so it's half of them who applied everywhere, or you have a lot of variability there.
So there's variation in two ways. I don't know if I understand your question, Simone. Let's clarify if I don't understand it well. So the census has the registration place where they registered for the census and also where they registered for the PEP. And a lot of them moved. So, for example, Sandra registered in Bogota, and then she moved to Maicao, and she went to another city, which was very far away. And that's where she got the job permit. And there is a lot of variation there. So that's why we said, okay, this is too complicated. We need to kind of focus only on the job permit place. Because otherwise we have these complicated movements of people across locations. I don't know if that answers your questions.
No, it answered my questions, but because a broader point that has come out in the exchanges that have gone on during your seminar is whether your variable is capturing the amnesty or simply the presence of Venezuelan.
It's the presence of Venezuelans. That's what I believe, because as I said, there is a huge distribution. So when they registered first is very, very different from where they actually got the job permit.
Can I jump in just with one very small comment on that? Is that I think what sets our paper apart, perhaps, is that we're not looking, we're trying to, even though it's hard, it's not on focusing on the people arriving, but the people that are there changing their status. But I think that those questions from Ellie and Steve and the one you said, I think at the end of the story, I think it depends on the time frame we have in mind, right? Because we're saying that we're picking up the effects of the change of status, but of course it might be that we're picking some lagged effect of the inflow. And I don't know if that's a problem for our paper. I don't think it's a problem, but I think we can certainly acknowledge that some of the effect might be like a lagged effect of the inflow that happened 5 months before. So the inflow happened probably 5 months before, or even more than when the permits were given, right? So you can have a little bit of both. We think most of it is what we think is an exogenous change of the status. But we certainly could acknowledge that, part of it could be the inflow, but anyway, the effects are null, so.
Yeah. One other thing to kind of follow up on Dany's comment, which I think was really, really good, is that, so actually the inflow of Venezuelans is very, very strong after 2016. And we still see people moving in the country during and after the program has been implemented. So that noise is there. Yes, there's Venezuelans arriving all the time during our evaluation. So what we try to do to kind of see if that's kind of affecting our results is we control for the early settlements of migrants. And so that's a very strong test, because this is, that there is all this evidence that migrants tend to move where they have networks or they have friends, a family. And so that's actually accounting possibly for that inflow of people, right? We use the census of 2005, the census of 2018, and we don't really see any changes in our results. Again, we're just not finding a result. So, yeah.
I give the word to you, Steve.
Sandra, did you guys try, I don't know if you have enough variation with your only 23 locations, but whether you thought about trying maybe interacting something like the importance of the informal market in different areas. I could imagine that in an area where if Bogota formality is more important, maybe the permit's more important. I'm trying to think if there is some heterogeneity where you could find some effects for Venezuelans. I don't know if you'll ever find anything for Colombians, but it would seem to me that the permit the permit doesn't matter a lot if I live in an area, at least for labor markets, it doesn't matter a lot if I live in an area where everyone's working informally. But of course, if I'm living, or maybe, well, you don't find, you'd look at my education also, right? You know, I'm surprised it doesn't matter more for high educated people. You would think that access to the formal sector would actually be important.
Yeah. No, but this is a great point. So we haven't explored that, so we can definitely try and do it. Of course, constrained on the variation, so we have to check if we have enough variation. But it's a great idea. Yeah, but it's a great idea. Yeah, it's very likely that if you have a very large informal market, then you might just decide to stay there. Although remember that there is a large premium for joining the formal sector that we have observed.
But you need to have a job that's possible.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. Definitely.
Martin?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wanted to come back to this point about the inflow of refugees and how the new arrival of refugees after the Amnesty have interacted with the applications in the PEP. Do you have actual data? Because you have a complete panel, right? But it may be that your results are influenced by newcomers, right? That they may be like affecting the labor market of those previous refugees.
True. Yeah. So originally, when we began the first draft of this paper, actually our instrument was the early settlement instrument, where we would use the migrants that arrived in 2018, the Venezuela, before the amnesty was offered, and we would instrument that using that variation. We didn't really see any impacts. However, there's something important that we have to acknowledge, which is that we do observe that after the program was announced, when they said, we're going to use this census to give an amnesty, there was an inflow of Venezuelan migrants. So it created endogenous migration. So presumably the migrants just thought, okay, maybe there's going to be another amnesty, so let's go to Colombia. So there was, for a couple of months, there was a large surge of Venezuelan migrants. However, all that we can do as of now, because we don't have exact numbers on that by city, is that we can control for the early settlements interacted by the overall migration of Venezuelans coming from Venezuela to Colombia, the aggregated amount. And when we do that, nothing changes. So I tend to think that that's controlling for that story.
Giuseppe?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Sandra.
Hi.
Great presentation. Unfortunately, your results are not that reassuring. I know. It was very interesting what you said with respect to the Venezuelan firms being sometimes not very receptive with respect to migrants. So I was wondering whether you have any way to see what happens to labor demand during this period in the different departments. So this can probably answer or at least say something about your guess actually regarding the Venezuelan firms.
True. Yeah. So we actually, when we were before the pandemic, we began a survey with Colombian firms in the main cities of Colombia, in which we actually tested for all of these hypotheses. So, do you hire Venezuelan migrants? Why yes? Why not? They have PEP? Why yes? Why not? And then we tested discrimination with different instrument questions, and then we had to stop it because the pandemic arrived and our response rate was very, very, very low. Of course, all the firms are trying to survive who's going to have time to answer a survey these days. So we will see maybe moving forward when things kind of get back if we can collect the data. But as of now, the chambers of commerce just said, you know what, we can't collect this data right now.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sandra. So
My pleasure.
Almost 6:30, so I would like to thank you and Dany for opening our seminar series this fall. It was very nice presentation. And thanks to all of you for being online with us. We're gonna have Anne-Sophie Beck-Knudsen from Harvard next week. And then on the following week, there's gonna be the online Migration and Development Conference by the World Bank and the AFD, and we will send out the program and all the relevant information in the coming days. And you are all welcome to join us online for the next seminars and for the conference.